Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Anora Wang. Today's topic is, can potential vertical integration harm be silver-screened horizontally? An empirical answer from the Chinese film industry. Joining me today is my co-host Panos Dimitrellos. Hi, Panos.
Hi, Anora. Happy to be here.
Would you do the honor to introduce our guests today?
Definitely. Our first guest is Charles Hodgson. Charles is assistant professor of economics at Yale University and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research focuses on industrial organization and applied microeconomics with particular attention to vertical relationships and market structure. He also studies how firms' strategic interactions shape competition, prices, and welfare in differentiated product markets. And with us, we also have Shilong Sun. Shilong is a senior economist at the consulting firm Compass Lexecon, and he's based in Washington, D.C., where he specializes in econometric analysis and modeling in antitrust and competition matters. He has also worked across a range of industries, including digital platforms, airlines, and retail, with research interests centered on vertical relationships and entry deterrence. His work often connects empirical design to merger analysis and exclusionary theories of harm.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Charles and Shilong, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks
for having us.
So, vertical merger review has a very well-accepted theoretical framework by looking at basically what the merged firm would have, whether that merged firm would have the ability and incentive to foreclose rivals. But agencies, the competition enforcement, at least in the United States, keep losing in court, and the empirical foundation keeps coming up short in court. Just looking at the DOJ's AT&T and the Time Warner case and FTC's Illumina Grail case, the framework seems to be clear in theory, but a little bit hard to satisfy in reality. Charles, you have a paper with Shilong that is supposed to change and at least give us a little bit better clarity on how the robust theoretical framework is going to be applied in reality, and how what is usually hard to satisfy is actually going to be a little bit more clear. Would you tell us how your paper is going to do that?
Yeah, of course. As you said, there's a theoretical framework when we're thinking about the harms from vertical integration, which basically is a trade-off between the efficiency gains coming from double marginalization and foreclosure, right? So the ability of a firm to control one layer of the supply chain and disadvantage rivals in another layer of the supply chain. Competition authorities typically use this idea of ability and incentive to address the risk of foreclosure, to assess the risk of foreclosure, where a firm might have the ability to foreclose rivals if it controls a bottleneck segment, but they only have the incentive to foreclose rivals if they can actually divert consumers, right, for example, in the downstream segment. And so the potential for vertical integration to cause consumer harm depends on basically the horizontal competition in the upstream and downstream segments. And in our paper, we look at a particularly clean setting where we have empirical variation in that horizontal market structure across different markets, where we can ask, can we actually measure how that horizontal market structure affects the potential for harm from vertical integration?
That is very helpful. Shilong, let's get to you. And obviously, we're going to talk about your paper with Charles a little bit more later on. But you also act as a consulting economist. You watch real cases on, the vertical integration matters included. Does what we just described match what you see, which is that the analytical framework is rigorous in theory, but a little thing in practice?
Sure. Let me talk about several observations I have. The first thing is, in cases that actually went to trial, many have been analyzed using some version of the ability and incentive framework. We've seen that in the high-profile cases that you mentioned earlier. But in those cases, ability and incentive really mean different things. There isn't really a starting point for us to approaching the theory of harm. I think that's one reason that applying this framework to actual cases can sometimes appear challenging. At the same time, some of the successful applications of the framework never make it to trial because the merger was abandoned. To name some examples, the BDS attempted acquisition of an upstream firm called ARM, and also Lockheed Martin's attempted acquisition of its upstream supplier, Rocketdyne. Those cases received much less publicity. So that's my second observation. My third observation is, as an industrial organization economist, we bring data to model. And to me, sometimes it feels more difficult to write a paper on vertical issues compared to writing a paper on horizontal issues. It simply needs more modeling work and data requirements much higher. Like we need data covering the data that covers multiple segments of a supply chain. So if you look back at the economic literature, back in the 80s, economists started to bring data to models of horizontal mergers. But it wasn't until the early 2000s that the empirical work on vertical relationship started to take off. So I think all these observations touch on your description. And yes, sometimes it's really challenging.
One of the things that stood out and I found very interesting when reading your paper was the industry that you chose. So your paper is supposed to help fixing the vertical foreclosure analysis, and it studies Chinese movie theaters. How do you get there?
Yeah, that is a great question. It's certainly an unusual industry to study in this kind of applied industrial organization literature. But it turns out to be a really useful industry for addressing this particular question. When we looked at the existing literature on vertical foreclosure, I mean, one thing you notice from reading review articles is that much of the literature, much of the papers, they're out there examine specific mergers or specific industries where maybe there's one merger event that changed vertical structure. And you might ask, okay, how did pricing, product provision, or whatever, welfare change before and after that merger event? And those kind of studies are useful, but they're very specific to that one particular industrial structure that they can observe. What we noticed that was interesting about the Chinese film industry was, first of all, this is an industry where there's lots of vertical integration. Movie producers own theater chains, cinema chains, and different cinema chains are integrated with different movie producers, and different chains have more market power or more market share in different regions of the country. So there's geographical variation in whether the dominant chains are owned by upstream producers. And there's also variation over time, right? In 1 week, there might be, in a particular city, there might be that none of the movies that are on release that week are vertically integrated, so to speak, with any of the theaters in that city. But it might be the next week a new movie comes out that is integrated with one of the theaters in that city. And so you have this week-to-week variation in the vertical structure of an industry, right? So week to week and also across geographies that we could use to sort of measure how pricing and product provision, just showing decisions in particular here, vary with that market structure.
So things that make sense, and I can see why that makes Chinese movie theaters a clean laboratory. But what does the regulatory setup strip away that normally makes foreclosure hard to measure traditionally?
Well, I think several institutional features of the Chinese movie industry make it really a nice setting to study foreclosure. First, as Charles mentioned, vertical integration is pervasive but not universal. And films are released nationwide in all theaters on their respective release dates. That means all theaters have same set of available movies to screen. They just need to choose which to show and how many showtime to allocate to each one. And next feature is the box office revenue is split according to a standardized contract. 8.3% goes to tax agencies, and of the after-tax revenue, 57% goes to theater and theater chains, and the remaining 43% goes to producers and distributors. So the incentives is pretty clear in our setting. If an integrated theater shows its own movie, it can capture a larger share of the box office revenue. And in many other settings, as you noted, foreclosure is hard to measure, either because vertical contracts are important, but we usually don't observe the details of those contracts, like the revenue split or the wholesale price. Or different downstream firms may have developed business relationships with different upstream firms, and we don't observe that either. In our case study, we don't have those confounding factors, and foreclosure behavior are very easy to observe and quantify.
And you're isolating the effect through showtime allocation rather than pricing, as one might expect. Why is this the right place to look? Why showtime allocation?
That's a very good question. We actually tested whether a theater lowers its price of its own movie to steer consumers away from rival movies. We simply didn't find any evidence of that. Why is that? I think that's consistent with what we saw in the industry, how ticket price is set in reality. A movie comes with a recommended ticket price that depends on factors such as the exhibition format, 2D, 3D, IMAX, and whether it's going to be shown in a big city or a small city. On top of that, theaters add a markup. That means theater may charge higher prices because it has a better location or more advanced facilities. But those higher prices are generally applied similarly across all movies shown in that theater in a particular week, meaning that the markup is roughly the same, regardless whether the movie is an integrated movie or not. When we look at the data, much of the variation in ticket price can be explained by the movie component and the theater component. So it's not surprising that we don't see price effect arising from vertical integration. That simply means theater use non-price variables to favor their own movies.
So I guess the $1 million question, often $1 billion question is, what did you find as it relates to the topic that we have today, which is the vertical merger review?
Yeah, I mean, so as Shilong suggested, we're focusing on foreclosure through showtime allocations, right? So an integrated theater is going to, in theory, is going to reduce the showings allocated to non-integrated films and increase the number of showings allocated to integrated films to try and divert consumers towards those integrated films. And indeed, we find that to be the case, on average across markets. On average, a non-integrated film experiences roughly a 4 to 6% reduction in showings when it's going up against an integrated film. So that means for a large, blockbuster in a large theater, that could be a reduction of about 30 showings a week. So it's a reallocation of showings towards integrated films. Not only is there this sort of average effect, but importantly, and that's sort of the point of this paper, that there's some substantial heterogeneity across markets, substantial and predictable heterogeneity. To be specific, we're thinking about, as we said, ability and incentive. What do we mean by ability and incentive here? Well, in this context, your ability to foreclose as a movie theater is really constrained by downstream competition. That is competition between movie theaters, right? So we find that moving from having zero local competitors, that is, I'm a monopoly within a 5-kilometer radius, there's no competing movie theater nearby, that's where you have the largest foreclosure effect. Adding one competitor within 5 kilometers, turns out that's going to reduce the foreclosure effect by about 13%. So there's a significant reduction in foreclosure as you start adding local downstream competitors. Right? And then you have the same thing with a similar thing with upstream competition. Right? Upstream competition is a question of how substitutable are the films, are the movies themselves. Of course, if two films are close substitutes, then the theater has a much larger incentive to try and divert consumers from one to the other. If we're talking about two movies that aren't close substitutes, like say we have a sci-fi movie and a sci-fi movie and a rom-com, okay, maybe they're very different audiences. If I try and reduce showings of the sci-fi movie to divert consumers to the rom-com, those consumers are probably just going to go and try and watch that movie somewhere else, right? Rather than switch which movie they're watching. So that type of movie level substitutability really is going to be important, very important for the incentive of firms, of theaters to foreclose through showtimes. And that's not only, in terms of the observed showtimes we see, but also our predicted welfare effects. We see that the effect on prices and consumer welfare on average are positive. In most markets, vertical integration is actually going to improve consumer welfare because of the efficiency gains, right? Because when when a theater is vertically integrated, it's going to show more films, more showings on average, in total. But that reallocation effect, that foreclosure effect, is going to dominate and actually harm consumers on net in those markets where ability and incentive are greatest. That is to say, there's limited downstream competition between theaters, and the movies that are on release are close substitutes.
This is very interesting, and I think your research is significant in the sense that you're not just saying that the foreclosure effects actually vary as you have observed, but you're also saying that it seems to be predictable. Right. So what are the conditions that you can use to sort of screen or predict the foreclosure effects? And why do you need, I guess, all of or both of the conditions that you have there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to what I was saying. You can use measures, such as the level of competition downstream, where you could think about, for a given movie theater, how many competitors there are in the nearby market, right, in their local market, geographic market. And for the upstream, you can think about, well, how similar are two films, how substitutable are two films. Now, very interesting questions about how we specifically measure those two things, which maybe we can get into in a little bit. But those are directly related to the ability and incentive margins that are thought, that we have in our theoretical framework. And what we're really trying to do is show that with the right model, you can actually measure those two things and show how foreclosure varies along those two margins. And you really need both. You need both ability and incentive to foreclose, which related to upstream and downstream horizontal structure, in order to get foreclosure. That's what we find.
So I think one thing, try not to overly simplify things, but you're essentially, I guess, proposing a screening logic for vertical mergers, and that's somewhat analogous to HHI thresholds in horizontal review. I guess that does simplify things, right? Like, incentive and ability seems to be this amorphous thing that's hard to measure. But how does your proposed screening logic hold? And how close is that to the HHI threshold?
Yeah, it's a good analogy. It's not perfect. I mean, it's basically, in a horizontal setting, right? We think about HHI, and so that's sort of a one-dimensional measure, right? It's either a highly concentrated industry or a not concentrated industry, and that's going to affect, determine how concerned we should be about a horizontal merger. Here, as I've been stressing, it's a two-dimensional question. Right, it depends on the horizontal structure in both segments of in both upstream and downstream segments of the market. Right, so you could think about, instead of a one-dimensional threshold, is HHI above a certain level, a two-dimensional threshold. We would be most concerned about the potential for vertical foreclosure when there's insufficient competition downstream. Right, there are no close substitutes downstream, and there's high substitutability upstream. In this context, that means the films are substitutable, but there's no rival theater to discipline foreclosure downstream, right? So you could think about it as a two-dimensional threshold. And we're not going to implement, we're not going to necessarily suggest that particular numbers here, what would be the right thresholds or the right measures. But this sort of idea that you have this two-dimensional threshold, I think is potentially useful.
And just to illustrate, I guess, what in your setting, what would distinguish a case that's where, like, the vertical integration is I guess pro-competitive or just merely neutral, as contrast to where it's competitively potentially harmful? Yeah.
So as I mentioned, in many of the markets, in most of the markets, vertical integration is essentially neutral or possibly welfare improving. Because in many markets, in our setting in China, there are in the time period we're looking at, there are many movie theaters in these large cities, and there's lots of substitution downstream, right? So if a consumer doesn't like what's on offer in one movie theater, they can kind of walk across the street, right? So that's something we measure, right? We measure consumers' willingness to substitute by moving to a different theater, right? by going maybe a mile out of their way to get a lower ticket price or to see a showing that they couldn't find at the other movie theater. And we find that, that's important for disciplining foreclosure. The other thing about measurement here that we need to do to try and ask, well, which are exactly the settings where vertical integration is harmful, is thinking about measuring the incentive to foreclose. As I said, the similarity of movies, the substitutability of movies, like what is the diversion ratio between movie A and movie B? Turns out that's actually a harder thing to think about. We don't have geographic distance there, right? Two movies, could be at first glance quite different, but could actually have an overlapping audience. So what we do there is we developed some methods using review data and some machine learning techniques. And the idea behind these methods is basically, well, if movies that get good reviews from the same people and bad reviews from the same people are likely to be similar, likely to have overlapping audiences, right? If movie A and movie B are likely to be similar, if consumers who like A also like B, right? So we use that idea and this review data to try and measure how similar movies are. Putting all those things together, right? Then we have a measure of the level of competition upstream, level of competition downstream. And then we can think about, okay, what's the threshold on those two dimensions under which vertical integration is potentially harmful?
So one kind of obvious parallel that one can draw to your application is digital platforms. An app store or a search algorithm is basically a showtime allocation machine. If you think about it, the higher up places in the ranking will draw most of the clicks, while the further down you go, you get less and less clicks. So does your framework map to something like this?
Yeah, I think so. If you think at a high level, a movie theater deciding how many showtime to allocate to each film is not that different from an app store deciding which app to feature, a search engine deciding which result to rank first, or a digital marketplace deciding which product to recommend. In all these settings, the platform controls a bottleneck segment that directs consumer attention. And that can potentially lead to customer foreclosure. So the key question is whether the platform, the search engine, the app store, or the movie theater has the incentive to do so. So in that sense, I don't see a reason why the analytical framework does not map there. There is actually a theoretical paper published by my Compass Lexecon colleague in Europe, Jorge Padilla, and his co-authors in the Journal of Industrial Economics in 2022, studying a platform's incentive to foreclose rival apps. And what they find is quite similar to what we find in our paper. They find that the incentive is stronger if the quality difference between a platform's own app and the third-party app is not very big. So I think it's a nice example to show that the framework has the potential to work well in the digital platform context.
Thanks, Shilong. So could you probably elaborate a bit on how you measure substitutability in your setting, and if that could be expanded to a real-world merger investigation, and how?
Yeah, definitely. As Charles mentioned, measuring substitutability between movie can be quite challenging. The reason is product cannot easily summarize by observable characteristic, say genre. Think about this. Avatar and Inception are both sci-fi movies, but you wouldn't say they are close substitutes. That's what we find from the rating data we find. And give you another example, Breaking Bad and Desperate Housewives may look very different on the surface, but to me, they have many elements in common, like the way the storylines push forward. Although we didn't apply our algorithm to Breaking Bad and Desperate Housewives, but if we do so, we may find that they are more similar than one may think. Back to your point, I think I'm very open to the use of this machine learning algorithm in actual litigation work, because there are usually industry reports where experts asked to describe how an industry actually works in practice. Related to this, if we can use tools that industry practitioners use to understand consumer preference, like what we did in our paper, that'd be really convincing to me. While I completely agree with you that in other settings, substitution is hard to measure for other reasons. For example, There are no prices in digital market contexts. There are 2 million apps on Apple App Store. The vast majority of them are free, no price. In that case, one way to measure substitutability is to use field experiment. Like in the FTC case against Meta, Professor John List designed an experiment where users are paid to reduce their Facebook and Instagram usage. He then tracked which apps consumers switch to and recover substitution pattern. That piece of evidence was cited favorably by the judge. We have other tools, of course. So once we have credible estimates of substitution pattern, we can feed them to the framework and do some analysis like vertical arithmetic to assess the risk of vertical foreclosure.
Yeah, can I add one more thing to that? I think, one interesting thing that one can do with this ratings-based measure of substitutability is try and validate it against actual observables. So turns out that the first order thing, when we generate this measure of substitutability, the sort of first order thing that seems to drive the correlation in demand for different movies is whether the movie is domestic, that is to say Chinese, or foreign, that is to say mostly Hollywood movies. So it turns out that people who like Hollywood movies tend to not like Chinese movies so much. People who like Chinese movies tend to not like Hollywood movies so much. So that's one example. That's sort of the most apparent pattern we see in this substitutability data.
That's really interesting. And going towards a policy direction, one can think that ability and incentive conditions can emerge post-closing, even if they're absent when the closing is signed. So what could this imply for remedy design?
Yeah. I mean, this is a I think a difficult question, right? One example here of this actually is closely related to the setting we're studying. So if you think about the United States, in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that movie studios could not own theaters chains, right? So they ordered Paramount and others to divest from their movie theaters for precisely this kind of vertical foreclosure concern. And then more recently in 2020, this decree was terminated precisely because the market environment had changed such that the court no longer thought, or the government no longer thought, that vertical foreclosure was a concern. In this case, it was because of the rise of streaming, of other distribution methods for films, right? So the horizontal structure has changed in that market, and therefore the vertical foreclosure concerns may no longer be as much a concern as they were, 60, 70 years ago. Okay. So I think what our paper basically does is looks across a variety of vertical structures and asks, okay, if you removed vertical integration in these specific settings, how that affect showing allocations and welfare. What it doesn't do, what it can't do here is really say, okay, what's going to happen in the long run? How is the horizontal structure going to evolve, and will that change the calculation? I think fundamentally that is an even harder question. In terms of remedies, I think it's a question of revisiting how that horizontal structure evolves over time, as in the Paramount case.
So thanks, Charles. Going towards the enforcer's direction. So your research identifies downstream concentration and upstream substitutability as the structural conditions that predict foreclosure harm. So the obvious question is whether those conditions could function as a screening tool in a vertical merger review, the same way that the 2023 guidelines use downstream concentration thresholds to triage horizontal deals. So does your research support that step, or does it stop short?
Yeah, I think it points towards that, I would say. I mean, basically our results say that, some of our results say that in this context, right, the Chinese movie industry, targeting enforcement towards a specific subset of markets where we think the conditions are met can actually increase consumer welfare if we force divestitures only in that targeted subset. If we in our simulations, if we force divestiture, if we force removal of vertical integration in all markets, that's bad for consumers, right? But if we target it, then we can actually achieve a gain in consumer welfare. Now, and as you say, this precisely is targeted based on those two measures of downstream competition and upstream substitutability. This is just one market, one industry, I should say, many market structures across one industry. What that targeting rule is going to look like is probably going to vary from industry to industry. And so before I made any specific or precise policy recommendations, I think we need more evidence along these lines from more industries.
I think that makes sense. And just back to what Panos just mentioned about the 2023 guidelines, the guidelines address the vertical deals, but it left basically what conditions or standards sort of like unspecified. So is it fair to say, I guess back to you, Charles and Shilong, it's fair to say your research moved the needle a little bit towards something more actionable? Or what would that actually look in practice?
Well, I like to cite Francis Lanfonty and Margaret Slay's paper in 2021, published in Review of Industrial Organization. The title is Presumption in Vertical Merger, the Role of Evidence. Both authors are well-established antitrust economic scholars, and they think toward a widely adopted presumption, if that's what you meant by something more actionable, we need systematic evidence on the efficiency and foreclosure effects arising from vertical integration. To us, the most relevant one is when and where is vertical foreclosure most likely to happen. After that, I think we'll need a second step, which is to see whether the framework can help us understand what we find from the data, the empirical evidence. Then we can talk about policy recommendations. To be honest, I think we're still short at the first step. We're looking for more evidence, but we're getting some exciting evidence. One good example is the March 30th episode of our Curious Amalgam with Zach Cooper, hosted by Anora U. Zach presented his joint work with Meg Rennan, Fiona Scott-Morton, Ashley Swenson, and other co-authors. In their paper, they actually find heterogeneous foreclosure results in the context of hospital-physician integration. And of course, I think we need more evidence like that. After we completed all the two steps, I think we start to think about how to operationalize the framework. At that time, I wouldn't be surprised if someone find diversion ratios, upward pricing pressures, or concentration measures can be useful in actual case. But I think it still take time.
Yeah, I think we're at the start. We're one paper, and Shilong mentioned another one there that are contributing to this idea that we need to systematically look at heterogeneity in vertical effects to develop these kind of screening rules. But we're moving in that direction, I think.
That's very helpful. And just to be clear, and we did not pay Shilong and Charles to say anything about other Curious Amalgam episodes. There is no paid promotion there, but it's always glad to hear that there's some cross reference and in a whole providing something useful to our listeners and viewers. So I guess time is coming up. So for people who have listened to this and maybe who want to read a little bit more from your paper and they just want to take one thing away from your paper, what could that one thing be?
Well, I think it's in the title of this episode. Really, it's the question is can vertical integration harm be silver screened horizontally? And the answer we're providing in this context is yes. Horizontal market structure, upstream and downstream horizontal market structure, can be used to think about when vertical integration can be harmful to consumers. All
right. So since we do have you, and we usually on a Curious Amalgam, we take the opportunity to give our listeners the opportunity to learn about you a little bit better as a person, not just as a professional. So I guess we'll take the turn. Charles, perhaps start with you. Could you tell us something about yourself that people may not have known about you if they have only worked or known you professionally? Yeah,
I guess, one thing that people are often surprised about is despite my accent, I grew up in Scotland, so I'm sort of an honorary Scot, and I have had occasion to wear a kilt. So that's something that people are often surprised about when they meet me.
I guess I did not expect that either. Shilong, what about you?
Yeah, one thing about me is I like visiting wineries. I used to live in Central Virginia for some time, and now I moved closer to DC. One thing I really missed about is the wineries there. There's so many of them, and I've visited more than 30 of them, spending Sunday afternoons there tasting different wines. And I know that on Monday morning, Charles will send me an email asking, hey, did you make any progress on our paper? I really want to say, made some progress, but I had a wonderful Sunday afternoon.
Well, that's great. I think it comes back to a question I should have asked at the beginning. How did you guys find the industries of your interest to study? Could it be, the wine industry, the film industry? Did you just find them by chance, or I don't know, somehow some clean data set you found? How did you find your industries?
This one, this paper goes back a while. To when I was in grad school, I had started thinking about this, and I was interested in vertical integration. And I was interested to learn that in China there is such widespread vertical integration in the film industry, and so that's sort of, I guess I learned about it through some of my colleagues in grad school, and we just started thinking about it, and then I connected with Shilong. Later, he was a grad student at Wisconsin while I was at Stanford, and we started thinking about this together. I think here it was the economics that came first, the question about vertical integration that really got us most interested in this industry. But I think that's one of the great things about being an economist, or specifically an industrial organization scholar, is that we get to think about lots of different cool, interesting industries that all have their, individual quirks and different questions that one could ask about them.
Very interesting. All right. This is a very interesting field, and you've provided a very, very insightful observations and some direction perhaps for future researchers, in the field. So thank you very much for coming to the show. We hopefully can catch up again, perhaps on this topic or something else next time. And thank you, Panos, for being a wonderful co-host, as always. Thank you, listeners, viewers. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org. Antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.